My roommate became my fake husband for tax benefits. Now I don't want it to be fake anymore. Jasper suggested the marriage on a Wednesday night while we were assembling cheap furniture from IKEA in our cramped Seattle apartment. He was holding an Allen wrench and squinting at instructions written in 5 languages when he said, "What if we got married for the tax break? We'd save like $8,000 this year." I almost dropped the wooden panel I was holding because that's exactly the kind of practical chaos Jasper brought into every situation. We'd been roommates for 18 months, splitting a 2-bedroom place in Capitol Hill that cost more than my car payment and student loans combined. He worked as a freelance graphic designer from the living room. I managed social media for a startup downtown. We were both broke, both drowning in debt, both single enough that marriage seemed like a business decision instead of a romantic one. I looked at him sitting cross-legged on our floor, surrounded by furniture parts and his messy hair falling into his eyes, and thought, why the hell not? We spent the next 3 hours researching tax codes on our phones while the half-assembled bookshelf sat forgotten between us. The actual wedding happened on a Friday morning at the courthouse with his coworker Daphne and my friend Quinn as witnesses. I wore a navy dress I already owned. Jasper showed up in khakis and a button-down shirt that still had the fold lines visible. The clerk who married us had done 6 other weddings that morning and treated ours with the same efficient boredom she probably gave everyone else. We exchanged rings we'd bought from a vintage shop for $30 total, said our legally required vows, and signed papers that made us officially married in the eyes of the government. Quinn took photos on her phone that looked more like documentation than celebration. Afterward, we went to a diner and split pancakes while filling out change of address forms for our banks and insurance companies. Jasper joked about finally making an honest woman out of me, and I threw a wadded-up napkin at his face. Everything felt exactly the same as it had the day before, except now we had legal documents saying we were married. Living together as a married couple wasn't different from living together as roommates, at least not at first. We still split bills exactly down the middle, still took turns buying groceries and cleaning the bathroom. Jasper still left his coffee mugs all over the apartment, and I still forgot to check if we had toilet paper before using the last roll. We filed our taxes jointly that April and celebrated when the refund came through, bigger than either of us had ever gotten alone. We used the money to finally replace our dying washing machine and took ourselves out to an expensive dinner where we ordered dessert just because we could afford it. The waiter assumed we were celebrating an anniversary and brought us complimentary champagne. We didn't correct him, just clinked our glasses together and drank to successful fraud. Though technically what we'd done was completely legal if ethically questionable, that night felt like winning something neither of us had quite understood we were playing for. 6 months into our legal marriage, Jasper's mom called asking to meet his wife. He'd told his family about getting married but kept it vague, letting them assume it was a real relationship instead of a tax shelter. His mom, Lorraine, was flying up from Portland for the weekend and wanted to take us to dinner. Jasper panicked for 3 days before her visit, cleaning the apartment more thoroughly than I'd ever seen him clean anything. He asked if I'd be okay pretending we were actually in love, making it sound like he was asking me to help him move furniture instead of perform affection. I said, sure, I can fake being married to you, which made him laugh until he realized I wasn't entirely joking. We spent the afternoon before dinner establishing our fake love story. We'd met through mutual friends, dated for 8 months before getting married in a small ceremony because we both hated big weddings. Simple, believable, mostly true, except for the dating and love parts. Lorraine arrived wearing expensive perfume and carrying wine as a gift, looking exactly like an older version of Jasper with the same messy hair and crooked smile. Dinner was at an Italian place downtown where everything cost twice what I'd normally spend on a meal. Lorraine asked questions about our relationship while Jasper and I performed casual intimacy we'd never practiced before. He put his hand on my knee under the table. I leaned into his shoulder while laughing at his stories. We traded bites of our entrees and finished each other's sentences like we'd rehearsed it, except we hadn't rehearsed anything. Lorraine watched us with this knowing expression that made me nervous, like she could see through our performance to the transaction underneath. Over dessert, she asked how we knew we wanted to get married, and Jasper said something about knowing when you know, which was meaningless enough to sound profound. I added that Jasper made me laugh every day, which was actually true even if the rest of our story wasn't. Lorraine smiled and said she could see how happy we made each other, and the lie felt so close to something real that I had to look away. After she left for her hotel, Jasper and I walked home in silence, his hand still holding mine because we'd forgotten to stop pretending. We started touching each other more after that dinner, small casual things that felt natural because we'd performed them once. Jasper would put his hand on my lower back when we navigated crowded spaces. I'd fix his collar before he left for client meetings. We began sharing the couch during movie nights instead of sitting on opposite ends, his leg pressed against mine while we argued about what to watch. He started making coffee for both of us every morning, leaving mine on the counter with the exact amount of cream I preferred. I'd bring home his favorite snacks from the grocery store without being asked, leaving them on his desk when he was stressed about deadlines. These small acts of care accumulated into something that felt like intimacy, even though we'd never discussed changing the terms of our arrangement. I caught myself thinking about him during my workday, wondering what he was doing at home, if he'd remembered to eat lunch, if he was lonely working by himself. 8 months into our marriage, my company had their annual holiday party at a hotel downtown with an open bar and a dress code that required me to buy something new. I spent 2 hours trying on dresses, finally settling on something dark green that made me feel more confident than I actually was. Jasper whistled when I walked out of my room, then quickly apologized like the sound had escaped without permission. He was wearing a suit I'd never seen before, dark gray that fit him perfectly, and made him look like an actual adult instead of the guy who wore sweatpants 80% of the time. We took the bus downtown together, and I noticed how other people looked at us, like we were obviously a couple heading somewhere special together. At the party, my coworkers kept commenting on how cute we were, asking how long we'd been married with that tone people use when they think love is brand new. Jasper played his role perfectly, telling the sanitized version of our story we'd created for his mom, making everyone laugh with his timing and charm. The party had dancing after dinner, and Jasper pulled me onto the floor during a slow song without asking if I wanted to dance. His hand settled on my waist like it belonged there, and I put my arms around his neck because that's what you do when you're swaying to music with someone. We moved together in the dim lighting, surrounded by my drunk coworkers who were all performing their own versions of connection. "This is nice," Jasper said quietly near my ear, and I agreed without specifying what this meant. We stayed on the floor for 3 more songs, holding each other closer than necessary for people who were just friends pretending to be married. Walking home that night, he kept his arm around my shoulders against the December cold, and I kept my arm around his waist, and neither of us acknowledged that we didn't need to keep pretending once we were alone. We made hot chocolate in our kitchen at midnight, sitting at our small table still dressed in our fancy clothes, not quite ready for the night to end. New Year's Eve happened 2 weeks later, and we stayed home instead of going to parties because neither of us liked crowds or paying $20 for a drink. We made elaborate snacks and watched the countdown on TV, drinking cheap champagne we'd bought specifically because the bottle looked fancy. At midnight, Jasper turned to me and said we should kiss for tradition, and I said okay even though my heart was beating faster than it should for something that didn't mean anything. The kiss lasted maybe 3 seconds, his hand on my cheek and my fingers gripping his shirt, both of us pulling away at the same time like we'd touched something hot. We laughed awkwardly and drank more champagne, and I went to bed an hour later with my lips still tingling and my brain refusing to categorize what had just happened. I could hear Jasper moving around in his room across the hall, and I wondered if he was lying awake too, thinking about how a fake kiss had felt more real than anything we'd done in the past 10 months. January brought freezing rain and a routine that felt different, even though nothing had officially changed. Jasper started working from the kitchen table instead of the living room, saying he needed a change of scenery but positioning himself where we'd naturally cross paths throughout the day. I'd make lunch and automatically make enough for both of us, and we'd eat together talking about nothing important and everything at once. He told me about his childhood in Portland, about his dad leaving when he was 8, about how his mom had worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat. I told him about growing up in a small town in Montana, about feeling trapped and desperate to leave, about still sending money home to help my younger siblings. These conversations felt like unwrapping something we'd both kept carefully packaged, revealing the actual people underneath the roommate arrangement. One afternoon, he fell asleep at the table with his laptop open, and I covered him with the blanket from our couch, my hand lingering on his shoulder longer than necessary. Valentine's Day was a Wednesday, and we both pretended it wasn't happening until Jasper came home with takeout from my favorite Thai place, and a card he'd clearly made himself. Inside, he'd drawn a cartoon of us assembling that IKEA furniture from the night he'd proposed marriage, with a speech bubble saying, "Nothing says romance like tax benefits." I laughed until I started crying, and then I couldn't explain why I was crying except that the card was perfect and thoughtful, and made me feel seen in a way I hadn't expected. I'd bought him fancy coffee beans I definitely couldn't afford, the kind he always looked at in the store but never bought for himself. We ate our Thai food sitting on the floor like we had that first night, except this time our knees were touching and the silence between bites felt comfortable instead of awkward. He told me this was the best Valentine's Day he'd ever had, and I realized it was mine too, which seemed impossible for something that was supposed to be fake. March brought the question of filing taxes again, our second year doing them as a married couple. Jasper made an appointment with an accountant because our situation had gotten more complicated with his freelance income and my new job. Sitting in the accountant's office, answering questions about our household independence and shared expenses felt more intimate than it should have. The accountant asked how long we'd been married, and we answered in unison, almost a year and a half, then looked at each other surprised we'd both kept exact count. She asked if we were planning to have kids for tax planning purposes, and Jasper said, "Not yet," instead of "no," which made my stomach flip in a way I didn't want to examine. Walking out of that office, I felt the weight of all our small lies accumulating into something that felt true, like we'd accidentally manifested a real marriage by pretending hard enough. Jasper grabbed my hand crossing the parking lot, and this time neither of us let go until we reached the car. His birthday in April brought the realization that I'd started thinking of his happiness as directly connected to my own. I planned a surprise dinner with his closest friends, people I'd met over the past year who all believed we were genuinely married. I baked a cake from scratch even though I'm terrible at baking, and it came out lopsided but tasted decent enough. When he walked into our apartment full of people yelling surprise, his face lit up in a way that made my chest ache. He hugged me tight and whispered thank you in my ear, his breath warm against my neck. During dinner, his friend Daphne, who'd been our witness at the courthouse, toasted to our marriage, saying she'd never seen Jasper this happy. He looked at me across the table with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between gratitude and confusion, and maybe fear. Later, after everyone left and we were cleaning up, he said he didn't deserve me, and I said that was stupid. We deserved each other. The words hung in the air, meaning more than either of us wanted to acknowledge. Spring turned into summer, and Seattle actually saw the sun for more than 3 consecutive days. We started taking walks after dinner, wandering through our neighborhood and talking about everything except what was happening between us. Jasper would point out dogs he liked, and I'd identify trees and plants because I'd gone through a botany phase in college. These walks became the best part of my day, the hour where we existed outside our apartment and our arrangement, just 2 people enjoying each other's company. One evening, we ended up at a park near the waterfront watching the sunset turn the sky pink and orange. Jasper said he'd been thinking about what happens when our tax arrangement stops making sense, when one of us wants to date someone for real or move somewhere new. I said I couldn't imagine living with anyone else, which was true but also terrifying to admit out loud. He was quiet for a long time before saying he couldn't imagine it either, and we sat there watching darkness settle over the water, both of us understanding something had shifted. July brought a heat wave that made our apartment unbearable because we didn't have air conditioning. We spent 3 days melting on opposite ends of the couch with fans pointed at us, too hot to move or think or do anything productive. On the worst day, Jasper suggested we go to the movies just to sit in air conditioning for 2 hours. We picked the longest film playing and spent the afternoon in a freezing theater sharing popcorn and not paying attention to the plot. His arm ended up around my shoulders halfway through, and I leaned into him because I was cold and he was warm and it felt natural. Walking home afterward, he said he'd rather be hot with me than comfortable anywhere else, and I pretended not to hear him even though my heart was racing. That night, I lay in my bed listening to the fan oscillate and admitted to myself what had been obvious for months. I'd fallen completely in love with my fake husband. August marked our official 2-year wedding anniversary, and Jasper insisted we celebrate properly. He made reservations at an expensive restaurant, the kind with cloth napkins and wine lists longer than the menu. I bought a new dress and spent an hour on my hair and makeup, telling myself this was just dinner with my roommate even though it felt exactly like a date. Jasper wore the same suit from the holiday party, and when I opened my door and saw him standing in our hallway looking nervous and handsome, I realized we'd both been getting ready for each other. Dinner was perfect and terrifying, full of comfortable silence and lingering eye contact, and his foot touching mine under the table. The waiter asked if we were celebrating something special, and Jasper said our anniversary without hesitation, without specifying it was our fake marriage anniversary. Over dessert, he gave me a small wrapped box that contained a new ring, delicate gold with tiny stones that caught the light. He said the vintage shop ring had turned my finger green, and I deserved better, and would I wear this one instead? I said yes because I couldn't say anything else, and he slipped it on my finger like a second proposal, except this time it meant something completely different. Walking home from dinner, something broke open between us that had been building for 2 years. Jasper stopped in the middle of the sidewalk and said we needed to talk about what this was, what we were actually doing. I said I didn't know what we were doing except that I didn't want to stop. He asked if I meant the tax benefits or the marriage or us, and I said all of it. I meant all of it. I was in love with him and had been for months. He kissed me right there on the sidewalk with people walking past and car horns honking, kissed me like he'd been waiting for permission and had finally gotten it. We stumbled home still kissing, barely making it through our apartment door before his hands were in my hair and mine were pulling at his jacket. We spent that night learning each other in ways we'd carefully avoided for 2 years. And in the morning, I woke up in his bed instead of mine, his arm around my waist and his face buried in my neck. Nothing about our situation had changed legally, but everything felt fundamentally different. The next few months were us figuring out how to be actually married instead of just legally married. We moved my stuff into his room because sleeping apart seemed ridiculous now, though we kept my old room as an office. We told his mom the truth about how we'd started, and she laughed and said she'd known all along. Nobody who wasn't in love looked at each other the way we had at that first dinner. We told our friends, and most of them weren't surprised, saying they'd figured we'd end up together eventually. The tax benefits stopped being the reason we were married and became this funny story about how we'd accidentally fallen in love through practical paperwork. Jasper started introducing me as his wife without the apologetic tone he'd used before, and I stopped correcting people who assumed we'd gotten married because we were in love instead of for financial reasons. October brought our third tax season preparing documents, except this time we weren't pretending anything. The accountant noticed immediately that something had changed, probably from how Jasper kept his hand on my knee the entire meeting or how I played with my new ring when answering questions. She asked if we had any life changes to report, and Jasper said we'd just figured out we were actually married instead of just legally married, which made her laugh. Filing jointly felt different, knowing it represented an actual partnership instead of a beneficial arrangement. We celebrated our refund by booking a small trip to the coast, our first real vacation together as an actual couple. Standing on the beach watching waves crash against the rocks, Jasper said he wanted to renew our vows someday, do the whole thing properly with people who mattered, and words that meant something. I said yes before he finished asking, because saying yes to him had become the easiest thing I'd ever done. Now we're sitting in our kitchen on a Thursday morning, drinking coffee from mugs we've accumulated through 2 years of actual cohabitation and 3 years of legal marriage. Jasper is looking at me over his laptop with this expression that still makes my stomach flip, even though I see it every day now. Last night, he asked if I regretted how we started, if I wished we'd fallen in love the normal way instead of through tax paperwork and convenience. I told him I wouldn't change anything because the practical foundation made everything else feel more solid somehow. We'd chosen each other twice, once for financial reasons and once for real, and both choices had been right even if only one of them had felt like love at the time. He reached across our tiny table and took my hand, the one wearing his second ring, and said he'd marry me again in every timeline and every circumstance. I believe him because I've learned that Jasper's practical chaos is just another form of care, and falling in love with my fake husband turned out to be the most real thing I've ever done. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.